The name William Wells Brown does not appear in the major American literature textbooks used in high schools across the United States. And yet in 1853, this man published Clotell, the first novel ever written by an African American, a revolutionary achievement that should have placed it beside figures like Hawthorne and Melville in the canon of American literature. But there is a reason his story was pushed into obscurity, a reason far deeper than simple neglect or historical oversight. Brown was not only a novelist, he was a formerly enslaved man who escaped bondage in Kentucky in 1834. And the knowledge he carried about the Southern elite, knowledge that implicated Thomas Jefferson himself, the author of the Declaration of Independence, made him dangerous. For decades after the novel's release, his work was banned in multiple states. His public lectures were interrupted by violent mobs, and his name was systematically stripped from the historical record with thoroughness that suggests intentional erasure. What did William Wells Brown know that terrified the establishment so deeply? What truths did he reveal that were considered so threatening they had to be buried for more than a century? And why, even today, do most Americans finish high school without ever encountering his name? Before continuing with the story of William Wells Brown, there is something I need you to do. If you're listening to this and you care about uncovering the hidden chapters of American history, the stories left out of classrooms, the voices deliberately silenced, the truths buried beneath polite narratives, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now. Leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where my fellow seekers of history are, because this story belongs to all of us. Now let's return to where it truly began. The story of William Wells Brown does not open with literary success or public recognition. It begins in the stifling heat of a Kentucky plantation in 1814, where a young boy learned that his very existence was a secret someone was desperate to conceal. Lexington, Kentucky, in the year 1814, was a place defined by contradiction. It was a city where lofty ideals of civilization coexisted with some of the most brutal forms of human exploitation imaginable. Known throughout the region as the Athens of the West, Lexington was home to Transylvania University, one of the finest institutions of higher learning west of the Allegheny Mountains. Its streets were lined with elegant federal-style homes, their white columns gleaming under the summer sun. Lawyers, physicians, and merchants carried out business in refined offices. Cultural societies gathered to debate philosophy and literature. To an outsider, Lexington appeared to be a shining beacon of enlightenment on the frontier. But beneath this polished surface lay an economy sustained entirely by human bondage. The wealth that built those grand homes, funded the university, and allowed merchants to prosper flowed directly from hemp and tobacco, and from the forced labor of thousands of enslaved people who worked the surrounding plantations from sunrise until long after nightfall. Lexington was also a major center of the domestic slave trade, filled with auction houses where human beings were bought and sold like animals, families shattered, and lives permanently altered by the highest bidder. It was into this world of stark contradictions that William was born sometime in the spring of 1814 on a plantation a few miles outside Lexington. His mother was a woman named Elizabeth, enslaved since birth. She was intelligent, resourceful, and quietly strong, qualities that would later shape her son. Elizabeth worked inside the main house of the plantation, which belonged to a physician named Dr. John Young. William's father was white, a relative of Dr. Young, though the precise relationship was never publicly acknowledged. This was not unusual in the slave-holding South. Across the region, children born of such unions existed in a painful in-between state, enslaved by law, yet often bearing the physical features and even mannerisms of the men who owned them. William's skin was lighter than his mother's, his features more defined, his hair looser in curl. These visible differences separated him from the other enslaved children on the plantation, and that separation would shape nearly every moment of his life. From his earliest memories, William understood the core truth of his existence. He was property. He could be sold, traded, or given away at any moment, entirely at the whim of his owner. He had no legal rights, no ownership over his own body, no guaranteed future beyond whatever Dr. Young decided for him. The law did not see him as a person, but as an object, chattel, no different in its eyes from a horse or a plow. And yet, William sensed something else as well. Something glimpsed in the furtive looks exchanged between his mother and certain members of the Young household. Something whispered late at night in the slave quarters when the white family slept. There were secrets inside that house, secrets about bloodlines and paternity, secrets about who his father truly was and why it could never be spoken aloud. Dr. Young sometimes looked at him with an expression that was difficult to decipher. Not quite guilt, not quite recognition, but something hovering uneasily between the two. Elizabeth never openly spoke about William's father. Doing so would have been dangerous, but she made sure her son understood that he was different, that he needed to be cautious, observant, and invisible when necessary. She taught him to read the moods of white people, to anticipate their expectations, to make himself useful without ever appearing threatening. These were lessons in survival, and she drilled them into him from the moment he could walk. As a small child, William was assigned light tasks around the plantation. He carried water from the well, ran messages between the main house and the outbuildings, and occasionally served at the table when Dr. Young entertained guests. He was sharp and observant, with a quick mind that absorbed everything around him. He watched how white people spoke to one another, how they conducted business, how they exercised authority. He listened closely to their discussions about politics and philosophy, about liberty and the rights of man. And he could not miss the deep hypocrisy at the heart of it all. Men who spoke passionately about freedom while holding other human beings in chains. Dr. Young was not considered the cruelest of masters. He did not whip enslaved people without cause, and he provided sufficient food and shelter. But he was still a master, and the system he upheld was one of total control. William saw enslaved people whipped for the smallest infractions, for arriving late to work, for speaking back, for attempting to learn how to read. He witnessed families torn apart when Dr. Young sold an enslaved person to settle a debt. He felt the constant, grinding fear that saturated life in the quarters, the ever-present knowledge that at any moment everything familiar could be taken away. In 1816, when William was only about 2 years old, Dr. Young made a decision that would alter the course of his life. The doctor chose to relocate his household to Missouri, a territory on the edge of the American frontier. Missouri was being rapidly settled by white Americans, many of them migrants from Kentucky and other slaveholding states, and they brought the institution of slavery with them. Dr. Young saw opportunity there, new land, new patients, new streams of income. The journey from Kentucky to Missouri was long and punishing. William was too young to retain clear memories of it, but his mother would later describe the weeks spent traveling by wagon and flatboat, the makeshift camps along the way, the difficult river crossings. For the enslaved people forced to make the trip, the journey was filled with dread. They were being carried farther from everything they had ever known, deeper into an unfamiliar wilderness where escape would be even more dangerous and where the possibility of ever seeing loved ones left behind diminished with every mile. Dr. Young eventually settled his family in St. Charles County, Missouri, not far from St. Louis. The region was still largely undeveloped, thick with forests and short, unestablished roads. Building a new plantation required relentless labor. Trees had to be felled, fields broken and planted, structures raised from scratch. William, though still very young, was put to work alongside the others. He learned what it meant to labor until his hands were raw and bleeding, to collapse and to sleep the moment his head touched the rough pallet in the slave quarters, and arise again before dawn to repeat the cycle. As William grew older, his responsibilities increased. By the age of 7 or 8, he worked in the fields during planting and harvest seasons and served in the house at other times. He was strong for his age, and Dr. Young began hiring him out to neighboring farmers and tradesmen who needed extra labor. This practice was common among slaveholders, allowing them to profit from their human property, even when their own land did not require constant work. It was during these years that William began to fully grasp the true nature of slavery. He came to see it not merely as a system of forced labor, but as one of complete domination, designed to crush the spirit as thoroughly as it exhausted the body. He encountered enslaved people who had surrendered all hope, who drifted through their days like shadows, their eyes hollow and resigned. He also saw others who clung to quiet defiance, who resisted in small, careful ways, working slowly when overseers were not watching, breaking tools by accident, singing songs layered with hidden meanings. And he witnessed the brutal consequences faced by those who resisted too openly. The lash, the stocks, or being sold farther south, a fate spoken of in the quarters with the same dread others might reserve for death itself. Throughout these years, William's mother, Elizabeth, remained his constant. She was his anchor and his source of strength. She told him stories of her own childhood, of the family members she had been separated from when she was sold to Dr. Young. She taught him to protect his sense of humanity, to never allow the system to convince him that he was less than a human being. And she taught him something else, something dangerous. She taught him that slavery was wrong, that it was a moral evil, and that the shame belonged not to the enslaved, but to the white people who upheld the system. This was radical knowledge, and Elizabeth was careful about when and how she shared it. Still, she wanted her son to know the truth, even if that truth carried risk. She wanted him to understand that the chains binding him were neither natural nor inevitable, that they were forged by human hands, and could be broken by human hands as well. By the time William entered his teenage years, he had grown into a strong, capable young man. He was tall and solidly built, with light skin and sharp features that marked him as mixed race. He was also intelligent and articulate, with a manner of speaking that sometimes unsettled white people. He had learned how to read, though he kept that skill hidden. Literacy was forbidden to enslaved people in Missouri, as it was throughout the South, and the punishment for being caught with a book could be severe. Still, William managed to learn, gathering fragments of knowledge whenever he could and studying in secret. In 1827, when William was around 13 years old, Dr. Young made another decision that would profoundly reshape his life. He sold William to a man named Samuel Willard, a merchant and tavern keeper in St. Louis. The sale happened without warning, without any chance for William to say goodbye to his mother. One day he was on plantation. The next, he was being taken away to the city, his future once again decided entirely by someone else. The separation from his mother was devastating. Elizabeth had been the one constant in his life, the person who had taught him, protected him, and loved him. Now she was gone, and William had no way of knowing whether he would ever see her again. The pain of that loss stayed with him for the rest of his life, and would later shape his writing about the deliberate destruction of enslaved families. St. Louis in 1827 was a city undergoing rapid transformation. Situated on the western bank of the Mississippi River near its meeting point with the Missouri River, it was quickly becoming one of the most important commercial centers in the expanding American West. Steamboats crowded the docks, their smokestacks pouring black clouds into the sky. The levee was alive with workers loading and unloading cargo. Bales of cotton, barrels of flour, crates of manufactured goods shipped from the east. The streets were filled with a diverse mix of people: French fur traders, American merchants, German immigrants, free black residents, and enslaved people like William. For him, St. Louis was a revelation. Life on the plantation had been narrow and tightly controlled, but the city revealed new possibilities and new ways of seeing the world. For the first time, William encountered free black people, men and women who moved through the streets without chains, who earned wages, who possessed legal ownership over their own lives. Some worked as barbers or laundresses, others labored on the docks or in small shops. Their freedom was fragile, always threatened by kidnapping and illegal enslavement, but it was freedom nonetheless. William's new owner, Samuel. Willie was a harsh man with a volatile temper and a deep fondness for whiskey. He operated a tavern near the waterfront, a rough, noisy place that catered to riverboat crews and dock laborers. William's duties included serving drinks, cleaning the establishment, and running errands at all hours. The work was exhausting, and Willie was quick to use his fists whenever he felt displeased. William learned to move fast, to read Willie's moves before they turned violent, and to make himself as invisible as possible. Yet the tavern also exposed William to something he had never truly had before: information. He listened as riverboat men talked about their journeys up and down the Mississippi, about distant cities they had seen, and about free states far to the north. He heard whispers of the Underground Railroad, a secret network of people who helped enslaved individuals escape to freedom. He heard about abolitionists in northern states who were actively fighting to end slavery. For the first time, William began to seriously consider escape. The idea terrified him. The punishments for running away were severe: whippings, branding, or being sold deep into the South. Slave catchers patrolled roads and rivers, paid generously for every fugitive they captured. The journey itself would be long and perilous, through regions where a black man traveling alone would immediately draw suspicion. And even if he reached a free state, he would still be considered a fugitive, legally subject to capture and forced return under the fugitive slave laws. But the alternative, spending his entire life in bondage, never knowing freedom, never controlling his own fate, was unbearable. William began to plan with care and patience. He saved scraps of food whenever he could. He studied maps when the opportunity arose. He listened closely to every conversation about geography, roads, rivers, and the locations of free states, committing details to memory. In the winter of 1829, William's life took an even darker turn. Samuel Willie, struggling with financial problems, hired William out to a man named James Walker. Walker was a slave trader, one of the most despised occupations in a society that already accepted slavery. Even many slave owners regarded slave traders with contempt, seeing them as scavengers who profited directly from human suffering. Walker, however, cared nothing for respectability. He cared only about profit. Walker's business was brutally straightforward. He traveled through Kentucky and Missouri, purchasing enslaved people from owners who needed quick cash or wanted to dispose of those they considered troublesome. He then transported them down the Mississippi River to the cotton plantations of the Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, where the demand for labor was relentless and prices were far higher. This fate was known in the slave quarters as being sold down the river, a phrase spoken with absolute dread. The cotton plantations of the Deep South were infamous for their cruelty, staggering death rates, and complete disregard for human life. William was forced to help Walker manage this human cargo. The role filled him with shame and fury. Though he was enslaved himself and had no choice, he was made complicit in the suffering of others. During those months, he witnessed horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Walker would assemble groups of enslaved people, sometimes 30 or 40 at a time, and march them toward the river. They were chained together in coffles, long lines of human beings shackled at the wrists and ankles. They walked for miles, feet torn and bleeding, bodies pushed beyond exhaustion. Those who slowed were whipped. Those who collapsed were dragged forward. At the riverbank, the captives were loaded onto flatboats for the journey downstream. The boats were overcrowded and filthy, offering barely enough space for everyone to sit. The enslaved were exposed to the elements, the burning sun during the day, the cold and damp air at night. Food and water were scarce, provided only in amounts barely sufficient to keep them alive until sale. Many fell sick with dysentery or fever. Some died along the way, their bodies thrown into the muddy Mississippi without ceremony, vanishing beneath the surface. William was forced to witness all of it. He helped chain the captives. He assisted in loading them onto the boats. He guarded them during the journey, ensuring no one attempted to escape. Every moment tore at his soul. He saw mothers ripped away from their children, the children screaming as they were dragged off, the mothers collapsing in grief. He saw husbands and wives separated, their desperate pleas ignored. He saw young women who understood what awaited them on the plantations. Not only brutal labor, but sexual exploitation at the hands of overseers and owners. He saw skilled craftsmen reduced to anonymous field hands, their years of experience rendered meaningless. He also saw the slave markets of New Orleans, where human beings were displayed on auction blocks like livestock. Auctioneers forced captives to strip down to their undergarments so buyers could inspect their bodies, examining teeth, muscles, and scars. Women endured especially degrading scrutiny. Buyers poked and prodded them, asking questions about health and work capacity, haggling over prices as if they were bargaining for horses or cattle. On one particular journey in the spring of 1830, Walker purchased a young woman named Eliza. She was in her early 20s, with dark skin and intelligent eyes that retained a quiet dignity despite everything she had endured. She had been sold away from her family in Virginia and was being transported to New Orleans, where she would be auctioned to the highest bidder. William spoke with Eliza during the journey, offering what little comfort he could. It was risky. Walker disliked his assistant speaking to the people he intended to sell, but William could not stop himself. There was something about Eliza that reminded him of his mother, a strength and resilience that refused to be crushed. Eliza told him about her earlier life. She had grown up on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, working in the main house. The mistress's daughter, a girl close to Eliza's age, had secretly taught her how to read, sharing books and lessons when no one else was around. It was an act of kindness that could have resulted in severe punishment for both of them, yet the girl had done it anyway, believing it was right. Eliza said she had been happy, about as happy as an enslaved person could be. She had friends in the quarters, a community that looked out for one another. She had even fallen in love with a young man named Samuel, and they had spoken about jumping the broom, an informal marriage ceremony that enslaved people used because they were forbidden by law to marry. Then her master died, and his estate had to be settled. Eliza was sold to cover outstanding debts. She was taken from Virginia in chains, never given a chance to say goodbye to Samuel, to her friends in the quarters, or to the mistress's daughter who had taught her to read. She was sold first to a trader in Kentucky, and then sold again to Walker. Now she was being carried farther and farther away, toward New Orleans, stripped of everything she had ever known. As Eliza told her story, William saw tears gather in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. She carried herself with a dignity that was almost painful to witness. She was intelligent, thoughtful, alive with feeling, yet treated as livestock, her humanity denied at every turn. When they reached New Orleans, Eliza was sold to a plantation owner from Mississippi. William watched as she was led away, her head held high despite the chains at her wrists. He never saw her again, but he never forgot her. In his mind, she became a symbol of everything grotesquely wrong with the system, a system that turned human beings into commodities, shattered families, and crushed love, hope, and dignity beneath the weight of profit and power. It was after that journey that William made his decision. He would escape. He would risk everything, his life, his safety, even a slim chance of ever seeing his mother again, for the possibility of freedom. He could no longer be complicit in the suffering of others. He could not continue to live as property. He had to try, even if the attempt cost him his life. William's first attempt to escape came in the fall of 1833. By then, he was no longer working for James Walker. Samuel Willie had hired him out to a steamboat captain who needed an extra hand for a trip up the Ohio River. The steamboat was an impressive vessel, one of the new side-wheelers that were transforming river travel. It had multiple decks, a grand saloon illuminated by chandeliers, and private cabins reserved for wealthy passengers. William was assigned to work in the engine room, shoveling coal into furnaces that powered the steam engines. The labor was brutally hot, filthy, and exhausting, but William did not complain. The boat traveled north to Cincinnati, Ohio, a free state just across the river from Kentucky. William had heard of Cincinnati from other enslaved people. It was known as a refuge for fugitives, with a large free black population and active abolitionist networks. If he could simply step off the boat and vanish into the city, he might have a chance. He planned carefully. He waited until the steamboat docked in Cincinnati, until the crew was busy unloading cargo and passengers were streaming ashore. Then, in the confusion, he walked away. He left the vessel, climbed the levee, and disappeared into the streets. For a few precious hours, William felt something entirely new: freedom. He walked through Cincinnati in awe, taking the sight of black people who live without chains, who move confidently through the streets unafraid. He saw black-owned businesses, black churches, black families living without the constant threat of violence or separation. But the freedom did not last. William had no money, no contacts, and no plan beyond leaving the boat. He stood out, a young black man without papers, without a clear explanation for his presence in the city. Within hours, he was spotted by slave catchers, professional bounty hunters who made their living capturing fugitives and returning them to their owners for reward money. They seized William on a street corner, ignoring his protests and dismissing the pleas of free black residents who tried to intervene. He was dragged to a jail used to hold suspected fugitive slaves, and word was sent to Samuel Willie that his property had been recovered. Willie traveled to Cincinnati to reclaim William, and the journey back to St. Louis was a nightmare. Willie was enraged, not only because William had attempted escape, but because the effort had cost him both time and money. He had paid the slave catchers their reward and covered his own travel expenses, and he made it clear that William would pay for every cent. When they returned to St. Louis, Willie ordered William whipped. The punishment was carried out in the yard behind the tavern, where other enslaved people were forced to watch as a warning. William was stripped to the waist and tied to a post. An overseer wielded a leather whip, striking again and again across William's back, each blow leaving a bloody welt. William fought to remain silent, clinging to what dignity he could, but the pain was overwhelming. By the time it ended, his back was torn and raw, and he could barely stand. The physical agony was horrific, but the psychological damage cut even deeper. William had tasted freedom, however briefly, and it had been ripped away. He had been captured, punished, and publicly humiliated. The wounds on his back would eventually heal, but the memory of that whipping would never leave him. Yet the punishment did not break his spirit. If anything, it hardened his resolve. He had tried and failed, but that failure did not mean he would stop trying. It meant he needed a better plan. Over the next year, William waited patiently. He continued working for Samuel Willie, doing whatever was demanded of him, keeping his head down and revealing nothing of his intentions. But inwardly, he was always calculating, always preparing, always watching for opportunity. He studied the geography of the region with greater care, learning which roads led north, which rivers could be crossed, and which towns were known for abolitionist activity. He listened closely to every conversation, storing away any detail that might prove useful. He saved scraps of food, hiding them for the journey he knew would come. He thought often of his mother, Elizabeth. He had not seen her since the day he was sold to Willie, and he had no idea where she was, or even if she was still alive. The thought of never seeing her again was unbearable. But William understood that as long as he remained enslaved, he would never have the power to search for her, to protect her, or to give her a better life. The only way he could ever hope to find his mother again was to first claim his own freedom. By late 1833, William was ready to try again. This time, he would be smarter and more cautious. He would not repeat the mistakes that had nearly destroyed him. On the morning of January 1st, 1834, William made his move. It was bitterly cold, with frost coating the ground and a sharp wind cutting in from the Mississippi River. The city lay unusually quiet, most people still sleeping off the previous night's New Year celebrations. Samuel Willie had sent William on an errand, instructing him to deliver a message to a merchant on the far side of town. It was exactly the opportunity William had been waiting for. Instead of completing the errand, he simply kept walking. He headed north, out of the city, toward the free state of Illinois. He had no coat, no food, no money. All he carried was his determination and the knowledge that if he were captured this time, the punishment would be far worse than a whipping. The journey was merciless. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, and William wore only the thin clothing on his back. His shoes were worn through, holes in the soles, allowing the cold to seep in until his feet went numb. He avoided roads, moving through open fields and dense patches of forest where he was less likely to be seen. When thirst overcame him, he drank from frozen streams, breaking through layers of ice to reach the water beneath. He ate whatever he could find, roots, dried berries, anything that might sustain him, though none of it was enough. For 3 days, William pushed through the frozen countryside. When he was lucky, he slept in barns, burying himself in hay for warmth. When no shelter could be found, he slept out in the open, shivering through endless nights, unsure whether he would freeze to death before morning. Every sound sent fear racing through him. The snap of a branch, the distant howl of a wolf, the faint echo of dogs barking far away. He knew slave catchers used bloodhounds to track fugitives, and the thought of being hunted down and torn apart terrified him. Still, William kept moving. He had come too far to turn back. He had risked too much. He would rather die trying to return to slavery. On the 3rd day, half frozen and delirious from hunger and exhaustion, William reached the town of Quincy, Illinois. He was free, at least in the legal sense. Illinois was a free state where slavery was prohibited by law. But William understood that laws offered little protection to fugitives. Slave catchers operated in Illinois just as they did in Missouri, ignoring legal technicalities when profit was involved. If they found him, they would drag him back across the river and collect their reward. William needed help, but he had no idea where to find it. He was alone in Quincy, with no contacts and no resources. He wandered the streets, keeping to the shadows, trying to decide what to do next. That was when he encountered a man who would change his life forever. The man's name was Wells Brown, a Quaker who owned a small farm outside Quincy. Wells Brown was in town that morning buying supplies when he noticed William immediately, a young black man trembling in the cold with the unmistakable look of a fugitive. His clothes were torn and filthy, his face hollow from hunger, his eyes darting nervously at every passerby. Wells Brown had seen that look before. He was an abolitionist, part of a quiet but determined network of people who believed slavery was a moral evil and who were willing to risk their own safety to help those fleeing bondage. The Quakers, guided by their belief in the equality of all people before God, were among the most active participants in what would later become known as the Underground Railroad. Wells Brown approached William carefully, speaking in a low, calm voice so as not to alarm him. He asked gently if William needed help. William hesitated. Years of experience had taught him that kindness from white people could conceal danger. But there was something in Wells Brown's eyes, an unmistakable sincerity, that made him take the risk. "I'm running," William said simply, "from Missouri. I need to go farther north." Wells Brown nodded. He did not ask questions or demand explanations. He simply said, "Come with me." He took William to his farm, a modest place with a small house, a barn, and fields lying dormant under winter frost. Inside, Wells Brown's wife had a fire burning in the hearth. One look at William was enough for her to act. She immediately began preparing food, hot soup, fresh bread, things William had not eaten in days. As William ate, Wells Brown explained the reality of the situation. Quincy was not safe. Slave catchers were active in the area and constantly searching for runaways. William would need to keep moving, farther north to places like Chicago or even into Canada, where American slave laws held no power. But before that, he needed rest. His body was exhausted, and his strength had to be restored. Wells Brown offered to hide him on the farm for a few days so he could recover. William accepted with deep gratitude. Over the next several days, as William regained his strength in the warmth and safety of the Brown household, he and Wells Brown talked at length. Wells Brown wanted to hear William's story, to understand slavery not as an idea, but as lived reality. William, for the first time in his life, felt able to speak openly. For years, fear had forced him to keep his thoughts locked away. Now, he finally had the freedom to tell the truth. He spoke of his childhood on the Kentucky plantation, the move to Missouri, and the pain of being torn away from his mother. He described his time working for James Walker, the horrors of the slave trade, Eliza, and the countless others whose lives have been destroyed. He told of his first failed escape, the public whipping, and the scars on his back that would never fully fade. Wells Brown listened in silence, his expression marked by sorrow and anger. He had long opposed slavery on moral grounds, but hearing William's experiences stripped away any remaining abstraction. This was not politics or theory. It was suffering, injustice, and cruelty inflicted on real human beings. Wells Brown then shared his own story. He explained that he was part of a loose but committed network of abolitionists working against slavery through both legal and illegal means. Some focused on political pressure and legislation. Others took direct action, helping fugitives escape. Wells Brown belonged to the latter group. He described how the network functioned. Safe houses spaced along northern routes, places where fugitives could hide, rest, and receive help before moving on. There were trusted contacts, coded signals, and carefully planned journeys, all designed to carry enslaved people step by step toward freedom. By the end of 1833, William felt ready to try once more. This time, he promised himself, he would be wiser and far more cautious. He would not repeat the errors that had nearly destroyed him before. On the first morning of January 1834, William finally acted. The dawn broke bitter and unforgiving. Frost glazed in the ground while a sharp wind rolled in from the Mississippi River. The city lay unusually still, most of its residents sleeping off the excesses of New Year's celebrations from the night before. Samuel Willie had sent William on what appeared to be an ordinary errand, instructing him to deliver a message to a merchant across town. For William, it was the opening he had been waiting for. Instead of carrying the message to its destination, he simply kept walking. He moved steadily north, leaving the city behind and heading toward the free state of Illinois. He had no coat to protect him from the cold, no food to sustain him, and no money at all. What he did have was an unbreakable resolve and the grim understanding that if he were caught again, the punishment would be far worse than a whipping. The journey was merciless. Temperatures stayed well below freezing, and William wore only the thin, inadequate clothes on his back. His shoes were old and worn through, holes in the soles allowing icy moisture to seep in until his feet went numb. He avoided roads whenever possible, cutting through open fields and dense forests to stay out of sight. When thirst overwhelmed him, he drank from frozen streams, smashing through the ice to reach the water underneath. Hunger drove him to eat whatever he could find, berries, roots, scraps of vegetation, nothing that offered real nourishment. For 3 days, he pushed himself through the frozen countryside. When luck allowed, he slept in barns, burying himself in hay to trap a little warmth. When there was no shelter, he slept in the open, shaking uncontrollably through long, miserable nights, wondering if he would freeze to death before morning came. Every sound set his nerves on edge. The snap of a branch, the distant howl of a wolf, the faint echo of barking dogs. All of it sent fear racing through him. He knew that slave catchers relied on bloodhounds to hunt down runaways, and the image of being tracked, caught, and tore apart by dogs haunted him constantly. Still, William forced himself forward. He had gone too far to turn back. He had risked everything. Returning to slavery was unthinkable. He would rather die trying to escape than live again in chains. On the third day, half frozen and drifting in and out of delirium from hunger and exhaustion, William staggered into the town of Quincy, Illinois. He had crossed into a free state. At least on paper, Illinois prohibited slavery by law. Yet William understood how fragile that protection truly was. Laws offered little comfort to fugitive slaves. Slave catchers worked Illinois just as aggressively as they did Missouri, caring nothing for legal technicalities. If they found him, they would seize him, haul him back across the river, and claim their reward without hesitation. William knew he needed help, but he had no idea where to find it. He was alone in Quincy, a stranger with no allies, no money, and no plan. He wandered the streets cautiously, keeping to the shadows, try to stay unnoticed while desperately searching for a way forward. That was when he encountered a man who would alter the course of his life. The man's name was Wells Brown, a Quaker who owned a small farm just outside Quincy. Wells had come into town that morning to buy supplies, and he noticed William immediately, a young black man trembling in the cold, clothes torn and filthy, face hollow with hunger, eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. He bore all the unmistakable signs of fugitive slave. Wells Brown had seen that look before. He was an abolitionist, part of a quiet but determined network of people who believed slavery was a profound moral evil and who were willing to endanger themselves to help others escape it. Quakers, guided by their belief in the equality of all souls before God, were among the most active participants in what would later be known as the Underground Railroad. Wells approached William carefully, mindful not to alarm him. Speaking in a calm, low voice, he asked whether William needed assistance. At first, William hesitated. Experience had taught him not to trust white people, had taught him that apparent kindness could conceal a trap. But there was something in Wells Brown's eyes, a sincere compassion, that persuaded William to take the risk. "I'm running," William said simply. "From Missouri. I need to go farther north." Wells nodded without pressing for details or explanations. "Come with me," he said. Wells Brown brought William to his farm, a modest place with a small house, a barn, and fields lying dormant under winter's grip. Inside the house, Wells's wife had a fire burning in the hearth. One glance at William told her all she needed to know, and she immediately set about preparing food. Hot soup, fresh bread. Simple meals William had not tasted in days. As William ate, Wells explained the reality of the situation. Quincy was dangerous for fugitive slaves. Slave catchers were active in the area and actively searching for runaways. To remain free, William would need to continue north, perhaps to Chicago or even across the border into Canada, where American slave laws held no power. Before that, however, he needed rest and time to recover. Wells offered to hide him on the farm for a few days so he could regain his strength. William accepted with deep gratitude. During the days that followed, as William recovered in the warmth and safety of the Brown household, he and Wells spent long hours talking. Wells wanted to hear William's story firsthand, to understand the true realities of slavery beyond abstract arguments. William, in turn, felt an overwhelming need to speak. For years, he had suppressed his thoughts and emotions, afraid that any honest expression would bring punishment. Now, for the first time, he could speak freely. He told Wells about his childhood on a plantation in Kentucky, about being moved to Missouri, about his mother and the anguish of being torn away from her. He spoke of his labor under James Walker, of the horrors of the slave trade, of Eliza, and countless others whose lives had been shattered by the system. He described his first failed escape attempt, the brutal whipping that followed, and the scars on his back that would never fully fade. Wells listened with sorrow and anger intertwined. He had always opposed slavery on moral grounds, but hearing William's account made the cruelty undeniable and immediate. This was not a distant political debate. It was lived suffering, injustice inflicted on real human beings. Wells also shared his own experiences, explaining that he belonged to a network of abolitionists fighting slavery through both legal channels and direct action. Some worked to change laws and influence public opinion, while others focused on helping fugitives escape. Wells was among those who acted directly. He described how the network functioned. Safe houses scattered along northern routes, conductors who guided escapees from one refuge to the next, and sympathetic ship captains who smuggled fugitives across the Great Lakes into Canada. The work was perilous. Anyone caught aiding runaway slaves faced heavy fines, imprisonment, or violent retaliation from angry mobs. Still, Wells and others like him believed it was a moral obligation they could not abandon. After several days, once William had regained enough strength, Wells helped to prepare for the next stage of his journey. He provided warm clothing, food for the road, and money, something William had never possessed before. He also wrote a letter introducing William to abolitionists farther north who could offer further assistance. More than any material aid, Wells gave William something far more powerful: hope. He showed him that there were white people who believed in justice, who recognized enslaved people as human beings worthy of freedom and dignity, and who were willing to risk everything to prove it. When the time came for William to leave, Wells walked with him to the edge of the farm. They shook hands, and Wells said words William would carry with him forever. "You are a free man now. Live like one." William continued north through Illinois and into Wisconsin. The journey remained dangerous, but it was easier now that he had resources and contacts. He stayed at safe houses, guided by conductors who knew the routes and the risks. He traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day, always listening for signs of pursuit. After weeks of careful movement, William finally crossed into Canada, taking a ferry across Lake Erie. When his feet touched Canadian soil, he felt an immense weight lift from his shoulders. He was truly free. The laws of the United States no longer held power over him. He could not be seized and forced back into bondage. For the first time, he belonged to himself. Yet William soon realized that freedom was not an ending, but a beginning. He settled in St. Catharines, a town in the Niagara region with a large community of former slaves. It was a place of refuge where those who had escaped bondage tried to build new lives. Starting over, however, was painfully difficult. William had no savings, no property, and no specialized trade. He took whatever work he could find, loading cargo on docks, chopping wood, performing grueling manual labor. The pay was meager and the work exhausting, but it was his labor, done for his own survival rather than for a master's profit, and that made all the difference. William wanted more than mere survival. He longed to educate himself, to reclaim the learning stolen from him by slavery. He could read, having learned as a child, but his education was limited. Now, with time and freedom, he pursued knowledge relentlessly. Every spare penny went toward books. He read history, philosophy, and literature. He studied the speeches of abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and the writings of formerly enslaved men such as Frederick Douglass. He taught himself grammar and rhetoric, practicing how to write with clarity and force. Night after night, he read by candlelight, driven by an unquenchable hunger for understanding. Eventually, William began to write himself. At first, his efforts took the form of letters to other fugitives, short essays about his experiences, brief accounts of life in bondage. He soon discovered a natural gift for language. His words capture both the horror and the humanity of slavery with vivid detail and emotional honesty. In 1836, William moved to Buffalo, New York, a busy city just across the border and a center of abolitionist activity. Drawn to the movement, he attended meetings of the local anti-slavery society and met activists committed to ending slavery through political pressure, moral argument, and direct aid to fugitives. It was in Buffalo that William first spoke publicly about his life. Invited to address an anti-slavery meeting, he stood before an audience of white abolitionists and told his story: his childhood in bondage, his mother, the slave trade, his escape. He spoke with passion and eloquence, and when he finished, the room fell silent before erupting into applause. That moment changed everything. William realized he possessed a powerful ability to move people with his voice. The abolitionists recognized it as well and encouraged him to speak more widely. They arranged lectures in other towns and cities, allowing him to share his story with ever larger audiences. Over the following years, William became one of the most sought-after speakers in the abolitionist movement. He traveled throughout New York, Pennsylvania, and New England, addressing crowds in churches, town halls, and open-air gatherings. Sometimes he spoke to hundreds, sometimes to thousands. He described his personal experiences in slavery, but he also addressed the broader moral and political questions. The hypocrisy of a nation that claimed liberty while holding millions in chains, the economic forces that sustained slavery, and the urgent need for immediate abolition. His speeches resonated because they were deeply personal. He spoke not in vague terms, but about real people, his mother Eliza, and the countless others he had seen bought and sold. He described the pain of separation, the cruelty of the whip, and the constant fear that defined life in bondage, making slavery real for audiences who had never witnessed it firsthand. Public speaking, however, also made William a target. Pro-slavery forces were active in the North as well as the South, and they resented his message. His lectures were sometimes disrupted by hostile crowds who hurled rotten vegetables, shouted insults, and issued threats. On more than one occasion, William was physically attacked, beaten by men determined to silence him. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 made the situation even more dangerous. The law required escaped slaves to be returned to their owners, even if captured in free states, punished anyone who aided fugitives, and gave slave catchers broad authority throughout the North. William was now living under constant threat once again. William was now a wanted man, with a price placed on his head. His former owner, Samuel Willie, had never abandoned the hunt for him, and the passage of the new law handed Willie legal tools to reclaim what he still considered his property. By 1849, fearing for his life, William made the painful decision to leave the United States altogether. He traveled to England, a country where slavery had been abolished in 1833 and where American slave catchers had no authority. England was also a center of abolitionist thought and activism, and William hoped he could continue his work there in safety. In England, William was warmly received by the British abolitionist movement. He lectured across the country, speaking to audiences who listened in horror as he described the realities of American slavery. He met prominent abolitionist writers, scholars, and politicians. For the first time in his life, he was treated with genuine respect and dignity, something he had rarely experienced in America, where even free black people faced constant discrimination and violence. It was during his time in England that William began work on his most ambitious project yet, a novel intended to expose the full moral horror of American slavery to the world. The book William Wells Brown wrote was unlike anything that had come before it. Titled Clotell, or The President's Daughter, a narrative of slave life in the United States. It was published in London in December 1853. It was the first novel ever written by an African American, a historic achievement that alone should have secured William a permanent place in literary history. But Clotell was far more than a literary milestone. It was a political explosion. The novel told the story of Clotell, a young woman who was portrayed as the daughter of Thomas Jefferson and an enslaved woman named Kerr. Alongside her sister Althesa, Clotell is sold into slavery despite her blood connection to one of America's most revered founding fathers. Through their lives, the novel exposed the brutal realities of slavery, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, the destruction of families, the violence and humiliation that were inseparable from the institution. At its core, the book laid bare the deep hypocrisy embedded in American democracy. Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the man who declared that all men are created equal, was depicted as a figure who fathered children with enslaved women and allowed those children to be sold into bondage. The story of Jefferson and Sally Hemings was not entirely new. Rumors of their relationship had circulated since the early 19th century, after journalist James Callender publicly accused Jefferson of maintaining a sexual relationship with an enslaved woman. For decades, Jefferson's defenders had denied the allegations, dismissing them as political slander. What no one had dared to do was to place that story at the center of a novel, to treat it as truth, and to use it as a lens through which to examine the moral collapse of American slavery. William did exactly that. He drew on the long-standing rumors surrounding Jefferson and Hemings, but he also infused the novel with his own experiences and with stories he had heard from other fugitives. The result was a relentless, deeply personal indictment of slavery and of the nation that sustained it. Clotell was structured as a melodrama, blending romance, tragedy, and moments of desperate flight. The narrative followed Clotell through a series of devastating trials. She was sold away from her mother, coerced into a relationship with a white man who promised freedom but later abandoned her, separated from her own child, and slowly driven toward despair. In the novel's most haunting scene, Clotell, pursued by slave catchers, leaps into the Potomac River within sight of the nation's capital, choosing death over return to slavery. The symbolism was impossible to miss. She died in the shadow of the Capitol itself, beneath the seat of a government that proclaimed liberty while preserving human bondage. Her death stood as a direct accusation against American hypocrisy, an image William intended to shock readers into confronting the moral reality of slavery. The novel also contained detailed depictions of the domestic slave trade, auction blocks, chain coffles marching south, families ripped apart without mercy. William drew heavily from his own experiences working for James Walker, and he did not soften the brutality. He described mothers separated from their children, the routine sexual abuse of enslaved women, and the cold indifference of traders who reduced human lives to commodities. Nothing was spared, and nothing was sanitized. In England, Clotell was met with significant praise. British reviewers commended its emotional force and its uncompromising portrayal of slavery. Abolitionists across Britain seized upon the book as powerful evidence in their efforts to pressure the United States to abandon the institution. The novel was translated into several languages and circulated widely throughout Europe. In the United States, however, the reaction was far more hostile. Southern newspapers denounced Clotell as slander and fiction. They attacked William personally, branding him a liar, an agitator, and a traitor. Editors claimed the novel was deliberately written to inflame public sentiment and encourage rebellion. They insisted that slavery was a benevolent system, that enslaved people were treated well in content, and that the atrocities described in the book were exaggerations or outright fabrications. Northern reactions were divided. Some praised the novel for its bravery and moral clarity. Others condemned it as dangerous and provocative, arguing that it would only deepen the divide between North and South. Many critics fixated on portrayal of Thomas Jefferson, which made them deeply uneasy. Jefferson was a national symbol, a founding father, a pillar of American identity. The suggestion that he had fathered children with an enslaved woman and allowed them to be soul-struck at the heart of the country's self-image, and many were unwilling to confront that implication. The novel was banned outright in several southern states, and booksellers who attempted to carry it were threatened with violence. William himself became the target of death threats. Letters arrived at his home in England, some describing in graphic detail what would be done to him if he ever returned to American soil. Even in Britain, pro-slavery sympathizers disrupted his lectures, shouting him down, throwing objects, and attempting to intimidate him into silence. William refused to yield. He continued to speak, to write, and to fight. He went on to publish additional works, including a travel narrative titled 3 Years in Europe, a play called The Escape, or A Leap for Freedom, and a historical study of black soldiers in the American Revolution titled The Negro in the American Rebellion. Through these works, William became one of the most influential black intellectuals of his era, a voice that could not be ignored or erased. In 1854, British abolitionists raised funds to purchase William's legal freedom from Samuel Willey. The act itself was little more than a legal technicality, but it marked the final severing of the chains that had once bound him. William had already been free in every sense that truly mattered, but the legal transaction meant that he could now return to the United States without the constant fear of being captured and forced back into slavery. In 1854, William returned to America and immediately resumed his work as a lecturer and writer. When the Civil War erupted, he became actively involved in the struggle, working as a recruiter for black soldiers and helping to organize regiments that would fight for the Union and for the liberation of those still enslaved. He also served as a physician, drawing on medical knowledge he had acquired over the years to treat wounded soldiers. After the war ended, William continued to write and speak publicly, advocating for the rights, dignity, and full citizenship of newly freed black Americans. Yet even as William's reputation grew during his lifetime, powerful forces were already at work to erase him from a nation's memory. The story he had told in Clotell, the story of Thomas Jefferson and his enslaved children, the story of the brutal realities of slavery, was deeply uncomfortable and profoundly damaging to the carefully constructed national narrative. As the country attempted to reconcile after the Civil War, as North and South searched for a way to move forward, inconvenient truths were quietly buried. After the war ended in 1865, the United States entered a period known as Reconstruction. For a brief moment, it appeared that the nation might finally live up to its founding ideals. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all people born in the United States, including those who had been enslaved. The 15th Amendment prohibited racial discrimination in voting. Black Americans seized these new opportunities. They voted in large numbers, ran for public office, and won elections. Black men served in Congress, in state legislatures, and as judges and sheriffs. Black communities built schools, churches, and businesses. For a fleeting moment, the promise of freedom seemed as though it might truly be fulfilled. But the backlash was swift and merciless. White supremacists in the South organized violent campaigns to reassert white dominance. The Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities, burning homes, lynching black men, and driving black voters away from the polls through intimidation and murder. In the North, support for Reconstruction steadily weakened as many white Americans grew tired of what they called the Negro question and were eager to move on. By 1877, Reconstruction was effectively abandoned, and the South was allowed to impose a new system of racial control known as Jim Crow. Under Jim Crow, Black Americans were systematically disenfranchised, segregated, and subjected to widespread violence and discrimination. The gains of Reconstruction were rolled back piece by piece. As part of this process, control over historical memory became essential. History was rewritten to soften the horrors of slavery and romanticize the Old South. School textbooks taught that slavery had been a benign institution, that enslaved people had been content and well cared for, and that the Civil War had been fought over states' rights rather than slavery itself. The contributions of Black Americans, as soldiers, activists, writers, and intellectuals, were deliberately erased from the historical record. William Wells Brown was one of the casualties of this erasure. His book slipped out of print. His name vanished from literary anthologies and history textbooks. The novel that should have secured his place in American literature, Clotell, the first novel written by an African American, faded into obscurity. Generations of students learned about Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, but not about William Wells Brown's Clotell. They studied Frederick Douglass, but not the man who had written the first African American novel, who had worked as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, who had lectured across 2 continents, and who had devoted his entire life to the fight for freedom. Why was William Wells Brown erased? The answer is complex, but at its core it comes down to power and control over narrative. William Wells Brown was dangerous because he told the truth. He described the brutal realities of slavery in vivid, uncompromising detail. He implicated Thomas Jefferson, one of the nation's most revered founding fathers, in the system of human bondage. Through his own life and achievements, he shattered the racist ideologies used to justify slavery. He was intelligent, articulate, and accomplished, living proof that Black people were not inherently inferior, that the difference between the enslaved and the free was not one of ability, but of opportunity. And that truth was deeply threatening. For slavery to function, it depended on a lie that Black people were suited for bondage, incapable of self-governance, fundamentally different from white people. William Wells Brown destroyed that lie. And even after slavery ended, the lie remained useful to those who sought to maintain white supremacy through other means. So William Wells Brown was erased. His books were allowed to disappear. His name was omitted from textbooks. His achievements were forgotten. It was a deliberate act of historical amnesia designed to preserve a particular version of American history, a narrative that minimized the horrors of slavery, celebrated the Founding Fathers without acknowledging their complicity in human bondage, and erased the contributions of Black Americans. William Wells Brown died in 1884 at the age of 70. He had lived an extraordinary life, rising from an enslaved child to a fugitive, to an internationally respected author and activist. He wrote multiple books, delivered hundreds of lectures, and helped dozens of people escape slavery. He fought for freedom and justice for his entire life. Yet by the time of his death, he was already being forgotten. It was not until the late 20th century that scholars began to rediscover William Wells Brown. Historians and literary critics, dating through archives and old newspapers, uncovered his books, letters, and speeches. Piece by piece, they reconstructed his story and began restoring his rightful place in American history. Today, Clotell is recognized as a landmark work of American literature. It is taught in universities, examined in scholarly journals, and celebrated as a pioneering achievement. Scholars have also confirmed that the rumors about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings were true. DNA evidence has shown that Jefferson fathered at least one of Hemings's children, and likely all 6. The story William Wells Brown told in Clotell, the story once dismissed as slander and lies, was in fact true. Even so, William Wells Brown remains largely unknown today. Most Americans have never heard his name. Most high school students never encounter his work. He remains a footnote in American history when he should stand as a central figure. The erasure of William Wells Brown is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a reminder of how history is shaped, how narratives are controlled, and how inconvenient truths can be buried for generations. Are buried. It is a reminder that the stories we choose to tell about the past carry immense power. Power to inspire, to educate, to challenge, and to transform. William Wells Brown spent his life fighting for freedom, not only his own, but for all people held in bondage. He risked everything to escape slavery, and then he risked everything once again to tell the truth about it. He wrote books that exposed the hypocrisy of a nation that proclaimed liberty while denying it to millions. He spoke for those who have been silenced, and he refused to be quiet. And yet, for more than a century, his voice was silenced anyway, not by chains, but by the deliberate erasure of his legacy. The question we must ask ourselves is this: what other stories have been buried? What other voices have been silenced? What other truths have we never been told? History is not a fixed, objective record of the past. It is a narrative shaped by people with specific perspectives and specific interests. And those who control that narrative hold the power to influence how we understand the past, how we interpret the present, and how we imagine the future. The life of William Wells Brown stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It is a story of courage, determination, and hope. But it is also a warning about how fragile memory can be, how easily history can be rewritten, and how relentlessly the powerful seek to control the story that is told. At the same time, it is a call to action, because the only way to prevent history from being erased is to remember it, to speak it, and to pass it on. William Wells Brown's story survived because people refused to let it disappear. Scholars searched through archives, assembled scattered fragments, and brought his life and work back into the light. Now, it is our responsibility to make sure his story is never forgotten again. William Wells Brown deserves a place in every American literature classroom. He deserves to be remembered alongside Hawthorne, Melville, and Stowe. He deserves recognition as a pioneer, a truth teller, and a relentless fighter for justice. His story is American history, and American history belongs to all of us. What do you think about this story? Do you believe William Wells Brown deserves a place in every American literature classroom? Do you think there are other historical figures whose stories were deliberately erased? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into hidden American history, stories about the people and events that shaped the nation but were left out of the textbooks, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you never miss a video, and share this with someone who loves uncovering the truth. History is not only about the past. It is about understanding who we are and who we can still become. See you in the next video.